The topic of this video was chosen by our backers on Patreon. To get involved and to support the growth of this channel, visit patreon.com/TLDR news. This is the 24th video in the Explaining Brexit series, and while it may feel like a lot has changed in the last 16 months since we put out our first video, it's amazing to see how little clarity we still have. We still don't know for sure whether the UK will remain in the customs union, free trade area or single market post-Brexit. We don't know if Brexit will end up affecting the borders between Northern Ireland and Ireland, or even how it will affect the Spain-Gibraltar border. We don't know how Brexit will affect the nations within the United Kingdom, or for that matter how it will affect the nations within the EU. We don't know if the UK is going to pay a huge sum to the EU, or if the UK will even reach a deal with the EU. We're still speculating what a no-deal situation will look like, and how it will affect all involved parties. In many ways, we don't know that much about Brexit. It's something neither side was particularly happy to admit back in 2016. In the midst of the referendum campaign, everyone was full of confidence, buses and slogans. So many people have been left confused and concerned by the chaos which ensued. In this video, we want to do two things. Firstly, plug the absolute living shit out of our previous videos. There's a link to the full Brexit Explained playlist in the description, by the way. And secondly, try and explain what's happening currently in the negotiation process. Disclaimer: before you jump into the comments and say everything I'm saying is wrong, please bear in mind, Brexit changes quickly. This video was written at the end of October 2018. Everything I'm saying is true as of the recording of this video, but disappointingly, I can't see into the future, so it likely won't stay relevant forever. Okay, now the section where I'm hostile to my own subscribers is over. Let's jump into the point of the video. There's three key things you need to understand to grasp the current situation of negotiations. These are the backstop, the extended transition period, and the people's vote. This section was released as a standalone video earlier this week, so if you've already seen our video about the backstop, you might want to skip over this section going to the timecode on your screen now. The backstop is a term you might have heard people use constantly when referring to Brexit at the moment. The backstop relates to what is potentially the biggest issue in the Brexit negotiations so far, the Irish-Northern Irish border. This 310-mile border has been completely open for 20 years since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement brought peace to the border. Currently there are no hard border crossing points between Northern Ireland and Ireland, with people able to pass freely between countries at the estimated 275 crossing points. The problem is that this might not be able to continue after Brexit. Forgive me if this seems obvious, but the EU needs strong external borders. The bloc works by setting rules and tariffs for goods and people entering it. Therefore, the external borders to the Union need to be hard, so all people and goods coming into it can be checked and monitored to ensure that they're following the EU's laws. Without a strong border, anyone or anything could sneak into the EU unchecked, and would effectively invalidate the EU's tariffs, quotas and laws. Similarly, if the UK wants to set its own immigration rules and create its own trade deals, it will need hard borders to prevent goods and people from getting in unchecked. You're probably one step ahead of me here, but having an open border between the EU and UK doesn't work well if both need to have hard borders to protect their policies and economic structures. Currently, both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland are in the EU, meaning that they follow the same rules and are part of the same bloc. That means that there's no hard border needed in the same way that there's no hard border between France and Germany. However, if no deal was reached between the UK and EU, that would all change. Suddenly, if there was no deal in place, then a hard border would be required between Ireland and Northern Ireland. That's not the EU being difficult or the UK media trying to use scare tactics. That's how international economic relationships work. You have to protect your borders. The fear is that if we put back a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, it could reignite tensions in the area. That's obviously something that no one wants to see happen, so that's where the backstop comes in. The backstop, as the name suggests, is a backup plan. It's not plan A, or plan B, or C, or even D, but it's designed to keep peace between Northern Ireland and Ireland, in case a deal isn't reached. Think of the backstop as a safety net. The backstop isn't supposed to be a permanent solution, instead it's just a temporary move to keep peace and stability in the area until a full deal is reached. The EU and UK did originally agree to the concept of a backstop back in December 2017. The problem is that the two sides can't agree on the terms of the backstop yet, and as such it's hard to say what the backstop will actually end up looking like. The EU has suggested a backstop agreement which would leave Northern Ireland in the EU's customs union, parts of the single market, and within the EU's VAT system. That is, until a final deal is reached. This would mean that until a complete deal is reached between the UK and EU, Northern Ireland would remain close to the EU, and as such there'd be no need for a hard border. As I mentioned earlier, there needs to be a hard border between the EU and UK to protect EU and UK laws. So if Northern Ireland sticks with the EU's economic policies, there's no reason to have a hard land border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the EU, as they're following the same laws. Therefore, we'd no longer need to worry about this border at all. However, it would only be Northern Ireland staying close to the EU, essentially shifting the border into the Irish Sea. The concern that many Brits have is this would potentially damage the overall union and be a step towards Northern Ireland leaving the UK altogether. This led to Theresa May rejecting the EU's backstop plan. She said that she preferred to see the entirety of the UK continue to be aligned with the EU for a limited time after Brexit, rather than see Northern Ireland left alone. The EU aren't fond of this idea, and neither is the Irish Prime Minister. The principle of a backstop is that it's an arrangement of indefinite length. According to the EU, the backstop is supposed to be a way of preventing a hard border until a better solution or deal is reached. The key word there is until. This means that the EU isn't going to be happy with Theresa May's proposed ongoing alignment until 2020 or 2022. The backstop needs to continue to be in place for as long as it takes for a better deal to be reached. Ensuring that the backstop continues to be in place until that point is vital to keep the EU and Irish governments on side. The problem for May is that a backstop like this would likely be a hard sell in the UK. As I said earlier, splitting Northern Ireland away from the rest of the UK and having it follow many of the rules and regulations of the EU Single Market and Customs Union is a slippery slope to some, and they believe it will lead to Northern Ireland leaving the UK and at very least damaging the UK's sovereignty. Considering the strongly held feelings of many Brexiteers, it shouldn't be surprising that there's a lot of Brits who aren't willing to see May capitulate to the EU and give up Northern Ireland. In fact, it goes beyond just the optics of letting Northern Ireland stay with the EU. It's also not currently legal. The Customs Bill doesn't give May much flexibility in this area, as one of the amendments explicitly prevents Northern Ireland from staying in the Customs Union. So the two sides have hit an impasse. The issue of the backstop is being blamed for holding up the negotiations process. The EU aren't willing to discuss a future deal until issues such as the backstop are handled, and the UK aren't willing to accept the EU terms of the backstop. Both sides recognise the need for a legal backstop, just not what it should look like. Some members of the UK government want to see a whole UK backstop, leaving the entirety of the UK and the EU until a deal is reached. But that's unacceptable to Brexit supporting MPs and citizens. The EU wants to keep Northern Ireland within its economic area until a deal is drawn, but splitting Northern Ireland away from the rest of the UK is unacceptable to the UK government, especially to the DUP. The UK government wants it to be time limited, with the entirety of the UK staying aligned with the EU a little longer, a proposal which is unacceptable to the EU, as it's just pushing the problem down the road. I'm sure you picked up this vibe already, but securing a backstop isn't going to be easy. Okay, so that's the idea of the backstop, which is something the EU and UK are struggling to agree on. This is making reaching a final deal so much harder, which is why some people are calling for an extended transition period. Currently, the UK is planning to officially leave the EU on March 29th, 2019. At which point, they'll enter into a transition period designed to make it easier for businesses and citizens to get used to a world post-Brexit. This transition period is currently set to continue until December 2020, which some say is already too far away. After all, the Brexit referendum took place on June 23, 2016, which means the whole process is set to take 4.5 years. So why are we looking to extend it even further? Something which wasn't really discussed during the campaign is how difficult Brexit is. This isn't just ghosting someone to end a casual relationship, this is a full-blown divorce. The UK has 45 years of history with the EU. Laws, trade and culture are so intertwined that pulling the two apart isn't simple, something which should be clear by now if you're paying attention to the government's negotiations. No one could accuse them of making this look easy. So there is discussion that the transition period could be extended, giving the UK longer to reach a deal with the EU. This won't be popular in the UK though, with those in favour of a hard Brexit already sick of how long it's taking, and even many of those who support an ongoing relationship between the UK and EU getting tired of the process. Dominic Raab, the UK's Brexit Secretary, has recently discussed the potential for extending the window of transition. He suggested that the extended transition period should replace the backstop, the idea being that if the transition is extended, there wouldn't be any need for a backstop, as the extra time would allow both sides to reach an agreement on the Irish-Northern Irish border. This might sound familiar to you. The UK government wants it to be time limited, with the entirety of the UK staying aligned with the EU a little longer, a proposal which is unacceptable to the EU as it's just pushing the problem down the road. So that strategy isn't likely to go down well. I already get accused of these videos being too biased towards remaining, and some people say I involve my own views too much, but let me just say, I don't have any confidence that extending the transition solves the backstop issue. Having watched the negotiations very closely so far, I don't have much hope that extending the transition period slightly will help both sides suddenly agree on the issue of the Irish border. I could be wrong, after all it's literally Rob's job to know more about Brexit than me, but I would absolutely agree with the EU's stance that extending the transition period is merely delaying the problem and doesn't replace the need for a backstop. The people's vote is another issue, and something which we've discussed before. This seemingly growing group of people want to see the British electorate offered another opportunity to vote on the outcome of Brexit. Last weekend it was reported that hundreds of thousands of people marched in London to support a second referendum. This movement stems from people's dissatisfaction in how the government are handling negotiations. It's looking more and more likely that no deal will be reached between the two parties, especially considering that Theresa May has to then take the deal to Parliament and get it approved there, and therefore some argue that the question has fundamentally changed. Back in 2016, we were told confidently by Leave supporting MPs that it would be easy to forge a better deal with the EU, and we'd be out before we knew it. The reality hasn't been quite so smooth. Remember when David Davis claimed that the UK's Brexit negotiator would fly straight to Berlin and broker a free trade deal with the German car industry? Or remember when Liam Fox claimed that dozens of free trade deals would be ready to sign the second the UK left the EU? Whether they knew that these statements were untrue at the time is up for debate, but what we all know is that they did end up being untrue. And because of this, some people believe that this means we should have a second vote on the matter. It's important to remember that there were three key groups of voters back in 2016. The people who voted Remain and didn't want to see the UK leave the EU, the people who voted to leave and wanted to see a hard no-deal Brexit, and the people who voted Leave believing Davis and Fox's comments that some new, better deal would be easily achievable. It's impossible to know how many people belong to each of these groups, but it's the middle group who could swing a second referendum. These people, often not represented in the media, might have voted to Remain if the choice back in 2016 was between a no-deal Brexit or remaining. Who knows what these people would do if they were given the vote again, but it's very possible that a number of them would rather see the UK remain over having no deal at all with the EU. I can already sense the chaos kicking off in the comments section. I'm not saying that I agree with the people who are calling for a second referendum, but that's the logic for calling one. The situation's changed. We should get to vote again. I'm going to be straight with you here. This video has been a bit of a mess, which, let's be honest, is rather apt considering the state of Brexit negotiations at the moment. The EU and UK can't agree to the terms of a backstop. A large proportion of the UK's population aren't happy with the idea of an extended transition period. Thousands of people marched calling for a second referendum. It turns out that people don't agree on Brexit. Who would have guessed? To keep up to date with the latest news on Brexit and everything else, subscribe to our channel and also our newsletter where we send out weekly news updates.